One of the purposes of the South Carolina Maritime Museum in Georgetown is to tell the tales of our rivers and bays. Lumbering is intertwined with this history. Presented here is the story of how our forests furnished timber for the shipbuilding industries of Maine and New England, and how excess logging decimated this natural resource.
Hundreds of years ago, forests of pine, bald cypress, and oak covered much of the low country of South Carolina. Loblolly and taller longleaf pines stretched inland 100 miles. South Carolina pines, live oaks, and rot-resistant cypress trees have been valued in shipbuilding since colonial times. The flexible fibers and durable surface of pine boards, especially longleaf, made them ideal for the wear that wooden hulls were subjected to in ocean swells. Curved oak limbs were perfect for framing.
Georgetown is located on Winyah Bay, 50 miles north of Charleston. Here, four rivers, the Waccamaw, Petey, Black, and Sandpit, join and empty into the Atlantic. In the early 1700s, Georgetown was a shipbuilding town, but by 1800, most shipbuilding had moved to New England and Georgetown grew stagnant.
Henry Buck, heir to the founders of Bucksport, Maine, worked in shipyards when he was a boy. When he saw the timbers of South Carolina in Maine ships, he sensed an opportunity. On the banks of the Waccamaw River in the 1820s, Henry Buck would open the first steam-powered sawmill in South Carolina. When he landed in Charleston at age 25, he booked passage on a small steamer that made weekly trips up the Waccamaw. He moved past earthen dikes and slaves working in rice fields, through swamps, and in the distance were walls of tall pines. He bought a few hundred acres of inexpensive timberland. Abundant wildlife inhabited Buck's land. Henry returned to Maine in 1827 and found financial backing for his enterprise. He married, but his wife stayed behind so he could get started immediately. He hired a few slaves from a nearby rice plantation, paying them wages to work. They built a simple log cabin and began to cut down longleaf pine trees with axes and saws, some over 150 years old. They roughed out heart pine beams and sawed them into lengths by hand. In a month, they had enough lumber to fill a small schooner. The Maine shipyard owner paid Henry well, and he bought more land and machinery for a steam-powered sawmill. He still had no house for his wife and son William, born in 1828.
Slaves cut down pine trees, dragged them with ox carts to the riverbank, bundled the logs in the long rafts and floated them with the tide to the sawmill.
Henry also tapped the sap of longleaf pines and bought a turpentine still. Farmers, since before the American Revolution, had been relying on pine sap for naval stores, products used in shipbuilding. Sap ran down from gouges into boxes cut into the base of pines. This process often killed the gouged pines. Pine branches were piled into a pit to smolder and release liquid tar. Some tar was boiled to make pitch, used in the seams of wooden ships. Many farmers cut down or set fire to tracts of pine trees that were in their way, so they could clear fields to graze cattle or plant cotton. The forest seemed to be an inexhaustible resource. Henry built a house on a bluff along the Waccamaw River named Upper Mill Plantation. He returned regularly to Maine, and in 1830 a daughter was born. Henry's wife told him she had no desire to live in South Carolina. They divorced, and Henry Buck took his son and daughter to live at Upper Mill. He obtained orders in the West Indies, South America, and Europe. In 1837, Henry and a partner purchased 432 acres and built another steam sawmill named Lower Mill, and later Bucksport. A competitor opened a sawmill between Buck's two mills. Eventually, Henry bought this property and installed a 30-horsepower steam sawmill, the largest in the area. He built wharves for a quarter-mile along the Waccamaw. The Bucksville community grew until it was larger than nearby Conway Borough. Henry married again in 1838 and had 7 children. His 3 sawmills worked full-time and shipping increased. By 1850, southern yellow hard pine was preferred for most ships built in Maine. Henry began to buy shares in vessels from Maine shipyards that hauled his lumber. By 1860, Henry was the largest slaveholder in Horry District with 300 slaves, but was against secession. His sons, however, fought for the Confederacy. For his opposition, he was assessed over $40,000 by the Confederate government. After the war, Henry's wealth fell from $1 million to $1,000, but he recovered quickly. He hired emancipated slaves and gave them land for houses and farms. His treatment of his employees led them referring to Bucksville as Utopia. With help from his sons, all 3 mills were shipping just as before the war. At 68, Henry Buck entered the state senate as a Democrat, where he remained until his death in 1870. Henry's son William took over the business, and son Henry Lee managed the lower mill. Lumber was in demand for shipbuilding in New England, railroad ties in the west, and factories and houses in the northeast. Buck's lumber was even used in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. In 1872, William Buck and Captain McGilvery conceived a plan to avoid the expense of shipping lumber from South Carolina to Maine, build the ships in Bucksville. They hired master shipwright Elisha Dunbar and 60 men from Maine to build the 240-ton schooner Hattie Buck in Bucksville. Based on the success of the Hattie Buck, William McGilvery and a retired Searsport master mariner and shipbuilder, Captain Jonathan C. Nichols, decided to build a much larger vessel in Bucksville, a 1,200-ton square-rigged ship, the Henrietta, named after the wife of Nichols, principal owner and first captain. The Henrietta was the largest wooden sailing ship ever built in South Carolina, and the only downeaster ever built in the South, a large, square-rigged cargo ship, known for its speed. Owners of the Henrietta included many from the Buck, Nichols, and McGilvery families. Elisha Dunbar, who had built several ships for Nichols and McGilvery, convinced 115 skilled men to come build the Henrietta by telling them they'd be living in warm South Carolina during the winter months when it was too cold to build in Maine. The shipwrights arrived in September, and it was still hot. They slept in camp-like barracks, and many became sick from malaria. Still, they managed to prepare a slipway and lay the massive keel of the ship in the fall heat, soon followed by an unusually severe winter. 1.3 million feet of lumber went into the Henrietta. The stem, stern post, breast hooks, and knees were built of oak. The rest of the hull was built of longleaf pine. As the frames were tilted into place with pulleys and ropes, their tops extended more than 40 feet above the river, higher than anything else in the village. She looked like a cathedral. Pine planking and interior ceilings completed the hull. Decks were spiked down and 2 large cabins were built. Seams were filled with oakum and cotton and sealed with pitch. 8 months later, the Henrietta was complete. She was 201 feet long, 39 feet wide, 24 feet deep when loaded, and drew 13 feet of water. The men were relieved to see a beautiful spring.
The Henrietta was launched in April of 1875 with masts and rigging lying down to avoid trees overhanging the river. She was towed by tugboat to Georgetown in a cradle of ropes and barrels to protect her as she bumped along the bottom of the Waccamaw. She moved over the shallow entrance of Winyaw Bay into the Atlantic Ocean. Rigging was installed in Charleston. Sails were delivered from Boston. The owners claimed that the Henrietta had been a financial success, costing about $77,000. They intended to build another ship, but northern companies threatened to stop buying Buck's lumber if they continued shipbuilding in the South.
Captain Nichols said the expense of moving New England workmen and other inconveniences was greater than anticipated. Elisha Dunbar returned to Maine. William McGilvery built no more ships. The Henrietta never returned to South Carolina. Throughout her career, she was known as a fast and reliable ship. Captain Nichols commanded the Henrietta on her maiden voyage from Charleston to St. John, Canada. With his wife aboard, they sailed to Liverpool and back. Nichols appointed the next captain of Henrietta, a cousin, who sailed the ship for 13 years, mainly operating in trade with the Orient and Australia. Her last captain, A.M. Ross, with his wife and 3 daughters, commanded the ship on a voyage from New York to Portland, to Melbourne, Australia, then to Boston. Captain Ross's family stayed behind in Searsport, and the Henrietta sailed for Buenos Aires to load lumber for New York. In New York, she loaded oil for Singapore, then came back and loaded oil for Yokohama. In August 1894, Henrietta was overtaken by a typhoon entering Kobe Harbor, Japan. She went aground and her bottom was damaged too severely to be economically repaired, and she was cut into small pieces, sold in bundles to the citizens of Kobe for use in stoves and fireplaces. Many other wooden sailing ships, owned by Northerners, spent their working lives hauling lumber and other cargo from the port of Georgetown to the northeast. Hyman Kaminsky, a local businessman and part owner of the Henrietta, was one of the few South Carolinians who had the foresight to commission his own cargo ship, the Lina C. Kaminsky, built in Maine. The 3-masted schooner could carry 300,000 feet of lumber and was part owned by heir to the Buck family. In 1885, she encountered foul weather in New York, loaded with naval stores. After a head-on collision, she was abandoned, later claimed by Kaminsky for a high price, but sold after he succumbed to the realization that steamships could haul lumber twice as fast. William Buck died in 1880 and was succeeded by his brother Henry Lee. Competition after 1885 from large lumber companies in the Midwest and East caused the lumber mills at Bucksville and Bucksport to go out of business by 1900. In 1904, the Bucksville mill burned, and the town of Bucksville died with it. Today, nothing is left except for the sawmill's brick chimney. Despite the huge sawmill operation, hundreds of thousands of acres of old growth still remained in the area. In the 1880s, big lumber corporations looked to the south after depleting the forests of the East and Midwest to satisfy demands for houses, factories, bridges, railroads, and telegraph lines. They bought tens of thousands of acres of cheap land and stumpage from cash-poor southern farmers. More sawmills started up along the rivers of South Carolina. During the late 1800s, the entrance to Winyah Bay was dredged to allow for larger steamships. New jetties were built. The wharves of the port of Georgetown were crowded with piles of lumber, cross ties, poles, cypress shingles, and barrels of naval stores being shipped by schooners and steamships to northeast cities. In 1900, Charles Flint, a wealthy New York financier, opened the Atlantic Coast Lumber Corporation in Georgetown. The company bought or leased all available timberland within 100 miles of the Waccamaw, Petey, Black, and Santee rivers, and built the largest lumber enterprise east of the Mississippi. The complex employed over 1,500 workers and could process over 2,500 logs per day. A pond stored logs waiting to be milled. The huge plant had multiple bandsaws, feeders, edgers, slashers, trimmers, steam drying kilns, a turpentine still, machine shops, a foundry, miles of electric trams, a hotel, and a company store. A plant run by DuPont used fermented sawdust to make alcohol that was used for dynamite. To entice skilled men to move to rural South Carolina, the company built new houses and hotels at the beach resort of Pawleys Island. They brought them into town by train and ferried them in on steamboat. A neighborhood of homes for lower-paid employees called Slabtown was built with siding from waste boards from the sawmill. Local men were hired for the hard labor of felling and transporting trees and for loading of ships. In Georgetown, stores sprang up along the waterfront, such as J.B. Steele Grocery and Dry Goods Company. Steele would order wholesale goods from the north. Steamships provided regular weekly service for freight and passengers from Georgetown to New York. Steele filled orders from residents along the rivers for goods ranging from fertilizer to plows to barrels of flour. Steamboats delivered cypress shingles, cross ties, barrels of naval stores, rice, cotton, tobacco, and many agricultural products from river landings to Georgetown, where they were transferred to steamships and transported to New York and other destinations. Hopes were high that Georgetown was growing in importance as a port, and in 1905 the town celebrated its centennial with large-scale parades and events. The annual tonnage of lumber shipped from Georgetown jumped from 60,000 in 1900 to 300,000 in 1905. Flint was also president of the Georgetown and Western Railroad. Spur tracks temporarily laid through the forest facilitated cutting on a more massive scale than ever before. Towns such as Trio sprang up along the extended lines of the railroad, only to die with the lumber boom. In 1913, a huge fire burned 2 of the Atlantic Coast lumber sawmills and much of the stored lumber. The mills were replaced with a more modern concrete and steel sawmill. The Atlantic Coast Lumber Corporation realized they were running low on trees in the 1920s, and by 1932 were out of business. Banks failed and downtown businesses closed as the Great Depression took hold. Clear-cut pine land did not regenerate quickly. Longleaf pine seedlings take 50 years to reach market size. As early as 1909, the Georgetown Semi-Weekly Times warned, "Yellow pine in this state is being used up rather carelessly." Conservation began, perhaps in 1927, when the South Carolina Forestry Commission was established to promote the idea of sustained yields from loblolly and shortleaf pine forests. After Roosevelt's 1932 election, the Civilian Conservation Corps planted millions of pine seedlings, erected fire towers, and plowed fire breaks to control forest fires. In 1935, International Paper moved into Georgetown, buying much of the cut-over timberland. They began planting shortleaf pine seedlings because they get to market size in 12 to 15 years. Some Civil War-era plantations were donated as large tracts of land to be protected. State and federal agencies and many environmentalists have established preserves. Of South Carolina's 19.2 million acres, most is forest, about 13 million acres. Today in South Carolina, the forest products industry is the #1 manufacturing industry and employs over 90,000 people. A cycle of planting, cutting, and replanting fast-growing species of pine trees has proven to be economically successful. Conservation organizations have encouraged landowners to enter into easement agreements, which allow trees to grow to mature size and provide habitat for wildlife.
During the late 20th century, longleaf pine, bald cypress, and hardwood forests in many parts of South Carolina began to make a comeback. Struggles continued between developers who want to remove forests to provide residential and commercial space for South Carolina's increasing population, and conservationists who want to maintain the beauty of nature and preserve resources for public use.